What happened, like I said, called my first awakening, it was so liberating. I honestly felt like I was born again. Like I died and was born again. I felt like someone cut my head off in a sense that all of a sudden I was just sort of living through and navigating the reality without this overlay of constant narratives about what was going on. And that in of itself was such a relief. We don't realize, how much of that heaviness comes from here. I just felt so free and so light. I was like, I don't need anything else in my life ever. I just gradually started to suffer a lot, suffer in ways that I've never suffered before. So I couldn't understand how after such a profound shift, I was not only suffering again, I was suffering even more. I had no idea who I was anymore. I was waking up with terror, basically. I felt like in the world of form and in the world of formless, but neither fully here nor fully there. I was sort of nowhere.
Welcome to the Endless Possibilities Podcast, where the journey of spiritual awakening and energy healing unfolds.
Oh, hello and welcome to the Endless Possibilities Podcast. My name is Gareth Duignam and I'm your host today for another exciting episode. Today on the show, I have a very special guest. Joining me today is Maggie G. Maggie has her own podcast and she interviewed me a few months ago and we had an amazing conversation, really amazing. And she has just released her book, Awakening to be Human. Her podcast is called Humanizing Awakening. Maggie is a transformative coach, astrologer, and author devoted to humanizing awakening. She sees herself first and foremost as a supporter and guide, walking alongside others through the parts of the journey she has traveled herself and sharing the insights she's gained along the way. She holds a PhD in sociology and a master's in political science. She's a lover of simplicity, learning, and laughter. Now, Maggie, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining
again.
me. Yes, I've done your intro already. I pre-recorded it before we met, so I've done that. So excited to be having a conversation with you. Firstly, let me say congratulations on your new book.
Thank you very much.
Do you mind holding it up there for the viewers and letting them know?
It's right here. I was just saying that this is a proof copy. I don't know if you can actually see it. That's why it has like a stripe that runs across. So it's like I had to order it in order to see whether everything goes okay on the inside. So yeah, it's here. Thank you for letting me show it.
Yeah, and I'm excited. We're going to talk all about your story today and your book, what's in the book. Yeah, we had an amazing conversation a couple of months ago. You interviewed me on your podcast and you made me feel very, very at ease and welcome. And I thought it was just like having a cup of cacao on the sofa with a friend. So yeah, your book came out and we were going back and forth with emails, and I thought what a a good time to come on and do a podcast with me. And if people want to look up your book, they can afterwards.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I'm glad that you're saying that because I feel the same about you. It's like I feel we have so much in common, even though we are very two different people, but in terms of just our humanness, generally speaking, and just the sort of being laid back, and also the fact that we both are not necessarily versed in like the knowledge about awakening and all the terminology
Scriptures.
that life basically threw us both into this process somehow, and then we had to sort of navigate it in our own ways. And so, yeah, I just feel like you're a kindred spirit. So yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, less about me and more about you, right? So this is your interview. So let's because I know you had a spontaneous awakening as well, right? And let's kind of get into life before that awakening. What was going on for Maggie before the awakening?
Right. So what was going on? Well, basically, I was at the point in my life where I was in a relationship, and honestly, on the outside, it looked like I had everything, Like I lived in a beautiful place, I traveled the world. I was doing my PhD. I think at that point I was already teaching and really enjoying that, doing that and pursuing my academic career. And I just started feeling very, very unhappy, even though it seemed like I had it all on the outside. But specifically, I felt like I was not happy in my relationship, and there came a point where I felt I just needed some sort of help, but I wouldn't even know where to look for that help. So I can't actually tell you how I started looking for some coaches or something like that. I don't know why I didn't lean into like a therapy or psychology or something like that. I think I've heard someone maybe talk about coaching. It felt more down to earth, less complicated. I don't know. So I think I was just sort of, yeah, unfortunately, it was so long ago that I can't actually remember how I ended up looking for people like that. And somehow then I also started looking, for help in places where I normally look, which was books, because I'm an avid reader. I've always been, I love to read. And so I ordered some spiritual books that my mom, of all people, recommended to me. I think like Osho books and like something like that, and then some sort of self-help books. And the spiritual books, honestly, I was put off straight away. I was like, I don't know, I have no idea what this person or these people are talking about. I couldn't relate to the language. This awakening enlightenment thing sounded like this is just for a particular type of people, special kind of people, or definitely spiritual people, which I didn't consider myself spiritual at all. But I was drawn to these things, but I would never consider myself a spiritual person, because in my mind, being spiritual meant living a certain lifestyle, going on to retreats, I don't know, going to India. These were like the cliche, burning incense, wearing crystals, like that was spiritual to me, or something like that. So I was definitely not that kind of person. And then I read some self-help, tried some stuff, but like nothing seemed to work. Though I had an experience which I now, let's say, would call a spiritual experience when I was in my late teens. I was it was a point of complete despair because of the situation at home, because there was a lot of turmoil in my household growing up. There was addiction and all sorts of unpleasant things. And I was just crying, because I felt like I couldn't do anything about it. I was just completely helpless. I didn't know what to do. And I was walking down the street and I met this friend and I had this conversation with him that was like really profound in and of itself. But then I remember walking back home and I had this moment of clarity, and I just sort of saw that everybody in my family was innocent, fundamentally innocent, that no one was hurting anyone on purpose, that we just were not, there was something else at play, and that I couldn't I don't know, I just saw the inherent innocence of everyone, starting with my family and then literally everyone else. And I felt that I wasn't a victim, I was not a victim, and that I wasn't a victim of this situation, and I didn't have to take this situation that was happening at home or anything from my childhood with me to my adult future and sort of use it as an excuse not to like get on with things or do things. But apart from, and I saw it with such clarity, it was just incredibly freeing. But also it was the very, very first time that I experienced what I call peace with capital P. It was just the kind of fundamental peace that sort of revealed itself in the midst of that turmoil, in the midst of this like turmoil in my head, turmoil in my household, and so on. And this was my first glimpse of, like I said, the sort of fundamental okayness that is available to every single person walking on this planet. But it didn't last. It was just like it made itself known and then it was gone. But it was profound, and it stayed with me, the memory of that, for quite some time. And so fast forward, I eventually came across a book. It was a self-help book, and at that point I was sort of done with looking for books, because I thought I'm just not going to find help in those books. But there was this one book that kept on like popping up in my Amazon
What was it?
recommendations. It was of all the most kind of cliche titles you can get in terms of self-help. It was You Can Have What You Want by Michael Neal. And I remember that, I was kind of like, I don't know why I was resisting buying this book. It was just so bizarre. I mean, ultimately it was just a book, but it's like it was following me. So I eventually bought this book, and I remember vividly because I was on holiday again I remember like in this beautiful place where I thought to myself, my God, so many people would love to be here. Like this was like a paradise like looking place. That I was sitting there miserable with that book, in my hand and not able to open it. It was the most bizarre kind of, resistance that I felt, and anxiety. And I looked at it, and I realized I have never asked myself what I actually wanted. And I felt so much fear just going there, because I felt that if I go there, it was not going to be just what do I want on the surface. It will just take me places, and it will force me to acknowledge things that maybe I don't want to acknowledge, and go to places that I don't want to go to necessarily. So now, I can say that in hindsight that, it's like I knew what was coming, like it would open, like intuitively, I knew what was coming, that it would open some kind of Pandora box and then I would be just like finished. And so, of course, it turned out to be true. It did open the Pandora box. I realized that I was so completely lost in other people's worlds from an early age. I was living other people, even though I had this like on the surface individuality. I was my own person. I was rebellious. I was always anti anything status quo and causing trouble in school for that reason.
Sounds
And
exactly like me, Maggie.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. We have a lot in common,
Yeah.
right? But I was never just willing to accept anything that authority says is true, or this is how it has to be. So I've had that, from a very early age, especially for some reason religious authority, which is why I left Catholic religion, which I was born into, didn't choose to be in, but I left for that reason, because I can't even tell you, Gareth, how I know. I remember I was maybe 11 or 12 and I was listening to sermon in a church, and I knew that I was listening to dogma. I was not listening to truth, but I wouldn't even know the word dogma at the time. Like I don't know how I knew it. I was like, there is no Jesus in this church. I'm out. You know what I mean? And I even read the book. I even read the Bible. I was like going to priests and asking them questions and asking them to explain to me the things that didn't make any sense to me. And I just saw a lot of fear mongering and happening, and just how the religion was used to control people.
Hi guys, I'm sorry for interrupting this amazing conversation with Maggie G. This is just a quick request to those who aren't already subscribed. If you're enjoying this amazing show and you want to help support us, one small little thing you can do that really goes a long way to helping is hitting subscribe. The more subscribers we have, the more YouTube pushes our show out to new audiences through the algorithm. And the bigger the audience we have, the easier it is for us to reach out to guests. And they're more inclined to just want to be interviewed. So hit subscribe. And now back to the show with Maggie. Thank you so much.
People, and I also believed from a very early age that there was something so fundamental and so universal that is for everybody, and that the main religions at the core point to that. But once they become institutionalized and dogmatized, they actually do the opposite. They sort of divide people, and cause conflict and over interpretations, and who knows the ultimate truth, and blah blah blah. So I was never okay with that. But I have now gone into like a different territory. So where do I go back? Do I go back to the Pandora box?
Pandora's box, definitely.
So Pandora box was open in a sense that I realized that, like I said, I was living other people's lives most of my life. And so I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know what I wanted, because I never asked myself that. And I started asking myself this question for the first time, and it was painful. It was just very painful. to realize, Gareth, anyone who knew me, that I was a queen of silver linings. You know what I mean? There was not a situation that I wouldn't find something positive about it, some kind of excuse for things that I wouldn't tolerate now, that was just crazy, And so I was living in my own kind of delusional bubble, so to speak. And that bubble started to burst basically when I read that book. And so, but it wasn't so much the book, but it was the author that I was really like, who is this guy? I need to know more about him. And so I started looking up I think I found it was his blog. And I started reading some entries and I was like, okay, this is different to this book. This is that, like, the book was it wasn't, but when I say self-help, I don't mean bad in any way, but it was this sort of, now I can say, looking at things sort of on a surface, so to speak, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't helpful at all. I don't mean it that way. It was helpful, and it was an entry point clearly for me to start looking, right?
Well, self-help is exactly how I started. It was Louise Hay's You Can Heal Your Life, The Four Agreements, books, Susan Jeffers, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. All of these books helped me to be a better version of myself, break away from negativity, negative thoughts, attract more love and prosperity into my life. So yes, I think they're great for a lot of people and an entry point into spirituality.
Absolutely. And so,
But it's not spiritual awakening.
It's not a spiritual awakening, but I will say there was a point in my life after my first awakening, which I'm gonna eventually get to, that I was such an asshole, Gareth, when it comes to things like that. Self-help, seriously. Come on, this is so lame and so superficial, and it's all about identity, and it's all a story, and la 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 la. So I was very dismissive of this, because obviously now I was seeing things more deeply, and so I was kind of above those things, right? Which life basically humbled me later on when it comes to this, as life does, eventually. So now I actually, there's none of that left in me, and I, like you said, it's such a brilliant entry point for many people. And you never know, it can be a self-help book, it can be a poem, it can be a passage in a book, it can be somebody literally saying two sentences to you, or overhearing. You never know what that entry point is going to be. So this is why I have nothing against self-help book whatsoever, and in fact I think there's absolutely place for them. And there's place for the sort of psychological conditioned self to look into. It's just that the place from which you're looking at changes after awakening. So you're not just stuck in that one layer, so to speak, of what makes us who we are, if that makes sense. So yeah, so here I was looking at his blog, and it sounded like he was talking about the nature of thought, a lot, and how we live in a thought created reality. And then he talked about consciousness, and that thoughts are transient, and that there's and I was like, I didn't quite understand what he was talking about, but something in me knew that what he was talking about was true, which is why I kept reading. And then at some point he mentioned that there's this fundamental well-being that's available to everyone, no matter what happens in their life, sort of external circumstances or what's going on in our heads. And it's like, I knew, I had chills going through it, because that was the peace with capital P. He called it I think it was a well-being or fundamental well-being. I don't remember exactly what he used to refer to this now, but I knew he was talking about that piece with capital P,
And you had an experience of that as a child, right?
And I had that when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
I had, right? So that's how I recognized it, that all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, he's talking about that thing that I glimpsed, as a teenager. And now he was pointing to this. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that he was a coach. He called himself a transformative coach. So he wasn't, there was no word of spirituality anywhere in what he was teaching, or there was no difficult or complicated rather terminology of any kind. He was just a great guy. He was just a very down to earth, but you could tell that he's speaking from something profound, So I was hooked basically, and I was hooked. I was like, I just have to, get to contact this person and work with him. And so we started on a sort of like a year journey. So I was still pursuing my academic career, but I started working one-on-one with him. And the beginnings were not particularly great because, this was probably the worst in my relationship, the worst time that I've had in a relationship. Like, I was really struggling, I was so unhappy. There was so much, all I wanted to talk about is all my problems, in that relationship. And what do I have to do to basically solve my problems and be happier and, whatever. But he kept on pointing to like this thought, that I have to, look at like what pointing me to what's before I even think these thoughts, what's before that, So I was like, me being stubborn, I was like, seriously, you know what I mean? Are you telling me that seeing whatever it is that you're pointing to is going to solve all my relationship problems and things like that? I was just so annoyed, and I think he didn't have a good time either, to be honest with me, because I
But
was
it's
just
very
like so.
natural. Like I meet with a lot of people, and a lot of the times you'll get the people who have not had a glimpse of an awakening yet, and it's all about talking. It's all like,
Mm-hmm,
I want to pick this apart. I want to understand it. It's all kind of on a
mm-hmm.
mental level. Whereas I know what he was pointing to, but it just, yeah.
Well, exactly. I was completely lost in all the narratives and what I thought I needed for things to change, you see. And he was trying to nudge me in a different direction, and I just kind of struggled to go there, which, like you said, and thank you for saying that, I just think it's completely normal, It's like we all start somewhere,
Yeah.
But it was so different, it was so different because he wasn't trying to, what was so different was like, he wasn't trying to, I suppose, he wasn't trying to tell me to like change my thoughts. He wasn't telling me to fix anything. He wasn't telling me to reframe anything. He wasn't giving me any like exercises even to do, or
He
how
wasn't
I should maybe
engaging with
come,
your mind.
right? So it was unlike coaching, because to me the coaching, or at least based on the books that I read, was all about thinking positive and change your thoughts and think differently and reframe it, and then you're gonna be great, and so on. So it was very challenging. And also, I was he was pointing to something that couldn't be understood intellectually. And me with my academic self was
Yeah.
like trying to get my intellect to get this, to grasp it. And I was hitting the wall. And it was so frustrating that my intellect was just failing me, basically, when it comes to this completely. So I honestly, at some point, I remember he invited me to a workshop he was doing with another coach, which was unrelated. It had nothing to do with these things, like thought creative. I mean, it was somewhat connected, obviously, but not strictly related to it. So I thought, okay, great timing, because I'm done. Like, I've had enough. Like, I can't understand what he's talking about. This is frustrating. So it's good. So I went, and we were literally just chatting over lunch, about something unrelated. Like, I was struggling with the task that we were given as a group, and we were chatting as to how I could approach this. And honestly, out of the blue, it was like my perception has shifted in an instant, and I just saw my I have just chills just talking about it, because it was like in an instant, it was as though I was looking at my entire life. So not just the particular situation with the relationship, I was looking at my entire life from like the bird's eye view almost. It was like looking at everything and seeing it without any narrative, no thoughts about it, no narratives. Like they were gone somehow. And I saw how everything was sort of neutral, and how the whole suffering comes from these ongoing narratives going on and on and on and on, and how they feel very true. And therefore they feel more like facts. The thoughts feel like facts. We're not even aware that how much thinking we're going, and how much of it is constantly happening in the background, so to speak, and how that creates our experience of whatever we're experiencing. So, and I just like laughed, because it was, one of the things that is so kind of difficult to say about, to convey about this, that it was so ordinary and so simple that I couldn't understand how I could have missed this ever, or how is it that we all don't know that? Like, how? And that, but it was extraordinary in a sense that all of a sudden, everything I thought I had to change in my life or in myself in order to be at peace, it was all bullshit.
Maggie, can I just go back to the actual shift in perception or awareness? What was like the catalyst? What triggered it? Was it, what, were you in conversation? Did you question something?
All I remember is that, like I said, we had this task, and I was struggling with that task. And so we were just playing with ideas as to how I could approach this. That's the best I can remember. And all of a sudden, I first saw how I could, like, I felt like I was stuck, very, very stuck in that moment. Like I was not capable to even do the task. And all of a sudden, I saw how I could go about it, which was completely outside of the box and very different to how everyone else went about it. And then that thing followed right after, So that to me was one of the most interesting bits, because I found that now, having spoken to so many people and hearing about so many journeys, there's just something that when you, for some reason, when you're trying hard to grasp this, it's almost like it's moving, the seeing it is moving away.
You're pushing it further.
Whereas at the time, I gave up on trying to understand it, you see? And so it's almost like as soon as because I gave up, my mind was no longer busy trying to grasp it. There was all of a sudden a sort of space for that insight to occur naturally. So I can't say, it really felt like the conversation we had was completely unrelated. Like in that moment, he was not doing anything to point me specifically to anything. It was just a conversation about a task, but it did something.
Oh, okay. And would you like, now knowing what you know, having interviewed lots of people on Awakening, would you say that was what they would call self-realization had clicked?
So I would say that this was now I know it was my first awakening, my very first awakening, in a sense that I don't have a word for it, but I wouldn't call it as, or maybe I don't know how I would, it's a good question, because I don't actually know. I call it my first awakening, but I don't know how to actually call it, or what would people call it.
Well, okay. So before I had an awakening, I came across Eckhart Tolle, right? And I started listening to his audiobook, and it was all being in the moment, right? Practicing the power of now. And I was like, how did I miss all of this? Like, I've been meditating for years, and I've had lots of mystical experiences and out of body stuff, but I just somehow overlooked the present moment. And being in the present moment brings peace and clarity, and everything feels much better than being caught up in this mental loop.
Mm-hmm.
And I started witnessing. I was kind of like just witnessing. I would notice that when I was in work, my hands were moving by themselves. And I was definitely in a different space. It didn't feel like I was in ignorance anymore, back in my mind and believing it. But it wasn't yet a spiritual awakening.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying is,
I mean,
did you have a sense of witnessing before that, or did it just come in as that first awakening?
It felt like it came completely out of the blue, But again, he was pointing me to this for quite some time. So I was already becoming aware that how much of thinking is happening in the background for the first time, that I was becoming even aware of that, right? So the thoughts, but I still didn't see into the very nature of thoughts. So for me, that first awakening was about seeing directly into the nature of thought as ephemeral, in nature and transient. That was the key, because to know that thoughts come and go intellectually, I can know that, but unless I really see into it, which is why I suppose it's called an insight, it's a direct seeing into it, then only then the thoughts were free to be, and they sort of lost like, it's not that I wasn't thinking thoughts from then on. Of course, there were thoughts, but my relationship to those thoughts was completely different, because I knew they were not facts,
Okay, so for me, the awareness, right, the witness somehow felt like it disconnected from the thought and the ego. It was like clicked back, and then it was like, oh, spaciousness. And now there was like a separate, I'm this spaciousness, and the thought is still here at the front, it's still going, but I'm not it. I'm independent of the thought.
Yes, that the very second thing about it would have been knowing, that was a sort of second part of it, that I knew I was not my thoughts.
Yes.
Right. So in other words, all of a sudden, my whole identity, whoever I took myself to be or who I thought I was, no longer looked fixed and solid.
Yeah.
So that was massive, and I would say that this was the first glimpse into what came last, in other words, just the isness, the things just basically are. But it was just a glimpse into it at that point. But that alone, was so, there was no, it was a permanent shift. That's another key. I never went back to seeing thoughts differently, no matter what. So even when it was such a liberating feeling, I wouldn't have never called it a spiritual experience or awakening at the time. To me, it was just I forever called it a shift, I just called it a shift, or like the permanent shift or a fundamental shift in perception. That's how I used to call it for years and years and years. And I suppose I didn't thought this was spiritual, because to me it was so ordinary and obvious. I just knew everybody can see that, but like for some reason we were struck by some sort of amnesia or something.
But at the same time, so amazing, right? It's like kicking off a really uncomfortable shoe or a piece of clothing that's been digging in. It's like, oh my God, I feel so relieved.
Yeah. And the thing is that that's what I'm saying. Like it was a sort of ordinary, but extraordinary in a sense that, like, coming from the perspective of whether it's self-help or any other modalities within like the personal growth, that innocently lead us to believe that we have to change something or fix something in ourselves or in our lives in order to experience that kind of peace. And I knew at that point that was not true. It just wasn't true, and how much we are invested in this fixing and in this on the surface, when there's something way more profound, where to me it wasn't all of a sudden the point to even, I wasn't interested in observing thoughts. Like thoughts all of a sudden were just free to be, no matter what they were. But I wasn't treating them as seriously, so to speak. So, they were not affecting me as much. I just couldn't. I think the most extraordinary bit about this shift to me was just how everything changed in an instant. Nothing in my external world has changed, but everything looked fundamentally different in an instant.
Why? Why you and why not everybody else? I often ask myself that, right? Why did it happen to me? Because I wasn't really, like, I was reading a couple of books, I'd looked at a couple of Muji videos, and I think, Eckhart, but I thought I was already going through a spiritual awakening. I thought spiritual awakening was just like, you're meditating, you're trying to make your life a bit better. I thought that was a spiritual awakening. I didn't realize that it was something awakens and realizes itself through your human form. So why does it happen to some people and not others?
My most honest and certain answer that I can give to you is I don't know. Like genuinely,
yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
like honestly, I really just don't know. I can give it a go and sort of speculate a little bit as to why, but I'm not sure that that would be helpful to it.
I mean, do you think maybe when we talk about reincarnation, maybe you had done it something similar in a past life or a previous life, and it just carried through.
Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at it from two different angles now. I think one is that you mentioned the karma, the past lives, and so on. Again, I can't speak of that with any certainty, any degree of certainty, whether that's the case. But I did hear people mention that, as like that's the reason why. Then when you're here, you sort of feel drawn to these things and so on, right? That's definitely like one option. But now I have sort of another angle from which sort of I'm seeing this in that, and I know that this sounds very vague and maybe frustrating, especially when someone is sort of in that process of seeking, that because there were several other shifts that followed, right? And so with the last one, that which we're seeking was who we already are. You see, that reality. And so it looks like, so whether someone is on this path or gets it or has those glimpses or has literally no interest in spirituality whatsoever, there's still that.
Yeah.
There's still that, I really don't have an answer to this, but I can also tell you that there is, some people basically have the pull. There's an inner pull that you're just not satisfied somehow with what's on the surface. And I think I've had that since I was a kid, I was always curious. So awakening aside, I've always had a sense that there was something greater at play. And I feel that even though consciously I wasn't aware that I was doing it, but I feel like on some level I was looking for what that is my entire life, so I was never satisfied with just any answer. I had to kind of, but why? This is why I'm laughing that, I think my first conscious thought ever was why, because that was such a pain trying to so there's something about that inner pull and curiosity that plays out to some and it doesn't to others. And in either case, it's okay,
Yeah. Totally. Okay. So you had that shift, and were you like me? Did spiritual seeking sort of raise its head after that first shift? Because I wasn't looking for enlightenment because I didn't know what it was. But then when I had that awakening, I was like, oh my God, I want more of this. Is that what happened?
Literally the opposite.
Okay, yeah. I'm going back to our interview that you did with me, and I remember your dark night of the soul opened up, right? When you started going through the awakening.
Yeah. So basically what happened, what happened, that insight, which I now, like I said, call my first awakening, it was so liberating. I honestly felt like I was born again. Like I was born, like I died and was born again. And I felt so liberated. You described it differently. I described it as like, you said, like taking the shoe off. I felt like someone cut my head off. And so in a sense that all of a sudden I was just sort of living through and navigating the reality without this overlay of constant narratives about what was going on. And that in of itself was such a relief, because it's like we don't realize, how much of that heaviness comes from here until it subsides or stops or whatever, even if just for a moment, so you can tell the difference, right? And so quite honestly, I wasn't looking for anything else because I didn't know it was an awakening. I didn't know that there was more. I didn't see it as spiritual experience. So I didn't get into any spirituality whatsoever, So I just basically went on living my life, because I just felt so free and so light. I was like, I don't need anything else in my life ever. Like,
how old were you, Maggie, when this happened?
I was, oh my God, 30?
Okay.
32, I think. I'm 46 now, so.
We're the same age, right? 79.
1979, whatever that means.
Yeah, don't remind me.
Yeah. I mean, this is what reframing looks like, rather like, oh, Shit, 46. Yeah. I mean, I can't, I don't, this doesn't, my age doesn't compute, but
Me
yeah.
neither. Yeah, it really doesn't.
Yeah.
I still feel like I'm in my early 20s.
Me too. Me too. I would say late 20s,
Yeah.
maybe, because early 20s, oh my God, all over the place. So, no. So basically what happened, I decided what has changed, I left my relationship. After 7 years. I decided to finish my PhD because I was so far into it at that point. And I've been through so many challenges doing it that I thought quitting was just ridiculous at that point. And I don't think my supervisor would have let me after everything we've been through. So I decided to finish my PhD, and I was still teaching, but I decided I wasn't going to pursue academic career, and I wanted to become the transformative coach like Michael. So I did his academy and everything, and so basically I started sharing this understanding and like guiding people into basically these insights and so on. So everything was great for about 3 years. And then all of a sudden, honestly, I just gradually started to suffer a lot, and like suffer in ways that I've never suffered before. So I haven't even suffered that way before the shift. Okay. I suffered, but nothing like that. Okay. And I was completely and utterly confused because I couldn't understand how, after such a profound shift, I was not only suffering again, I was suffering even more. I had no idea who I was anymore. I was waking up with terror basically almost every
Wow.
morning. Not anxiety, terror. I felt like all of a sudden I was living in like in the world of form and in the world of formless, but neither fully here nor fully there. So I was sort of nowhere, and that nowhere was frightening.
It
It
feels
was
like you're losing your
frightening.
mind.
Yeah, it felt like
Yeah.
I felt like I was. I mean, there were times when I thought, yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm not mentally
Yeah.
stable anymore.
And I know because, right, like a lot of people will complain about, not having an awakening and being identified with the ego, but you feel really solid, right? You feel really, this is my body, this is who I am, this is who I identify. And then when you go through an awakening, it's like you don't even have that. There's no ground for you to kind of rest on. It's like free falling.
Yep. Yep. And I think the most frightening part was that I didn't know what the hell was going on, because I didn't know you. I didn't know people who've been through this journey, who've been through the stages. I didn't know anything about the process of awakening. I didn't know I had no reference point. I didn't have anyone who's been through it to tell me, okay, we're entering stage whatever, and by the way, this is normal part of the process, and here how, I can support you through this or something like that. I was completely on my own. I had no idea what was going on with me. I all of a sudden, even in terms of the external life, I no longer knew what I wanted to do. Like, I thought I knew what I wanted to do, and now I couldn't care less. I didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to do anything. I couldn't give a shit. All of a sudden, the things that held some sort of meaning in trying to achieve something, even though honestly I would never call I've never been like totally materialistic. I've never been like, I was sort of brought up this way to not attach too much importance to these things. But whatever importance I had, that was enough, because once it went, it was like, I have no clue how I'm supposed to live in this society. Like, how I just didn't know who I was, what I wanted to do, and it was absolutely frightening. And so I was oscillating between the waves of terror and feeling like I'm gonna be sucked into this black void any minute and die. And when I say it sounds very dramatic, but it really was like that. It was so frightening that I remember standing on a patio with my partner, and I remember that void, like black void, sort of like opened up, and I was holding on to his arm because I thought it, like, if this sucks me in, I'm done. I will die, literally, like, I'll die. And I remember it shook me for days. It was just so frightening, this experience. And I remember saying to him, without the first insight, I have no idea how people go through this. I have no people how, because there was something, even though it was everything was so terrifying, there was this fundamental okayness somewhere that never left, you know, after the first awakening. And so something in me knew that I was fundamentally okay despite all of this happening. But without knowing that, I'll be honest with you, I I don't know. This was the only bit that I hesitated writing in the book. But like the number of times I wanted to like just end my life, you know. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's totally fine. It's totally fine.
You
Look,
know, but
I
it was
can
just
totally relate. I totally know. I sat one evening talking on my Zoom group, fighting off the tears, thinking that I
yeah.
had totally fucked up my life, totally broke the human. There was no coming back.
Broke the human. I remember that.
Yeah, and I was the same. I sat there and I was like, I just felt like a ghost. So I totally relate.
Oh
I
my
noticed.
God,
Yeah,
that's it. I felt like a ghost. I felt like a
yeah,
ghost. I felt like I was dead inside, you know, like I was dead
yeah,
inside. I was so numb. You know, my
yeah.
normal, I'm quite I'm a kind of a weird mix of sort of being outspoken and ha 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 and la la la, you know, which is very much part of my personality. But I'm also very much a hermit, you know. People are surprised at like how much time I just spent on my own. But this was a different kind of, this was like I was just completely numb. I was so, now in retrospect, I can tell you, I was so shut down. I was completely disconnected from my body, you know. And all I kept on saying was like, oh, it's just a thought, you know, it's just an illusion. Like, and it became almost like a mantra, like I was shielding myself from the discomfort that I was experiencing at the time, you know. And so the reason why I'm saying this also with the wanting to like end my life is because that's when in retrospect I got to appreciate, even though I went through all the other shifts, I got to appreciate that first insight, that first awakening so much, you know, because I knew that it saved my life. I knew that because there was something deeper in me that I believe is in all of us, right? That fundamental okayness, despite of what was happening, and knowing that it will eventually pass. Like I just knew this will eventually pass. I didn't know when or how long it would take, but there was a knowing that it would pass. And that alone was enough, clearly, for me to stay, to not act upon, to not act on those thoughts.
Just listening to you talk as well, one of the things that's just popping into my head is like that there's a reason why these shifts happen in a succession of smaller shifts. Because like, can you imagine that just hitting you out of nowhere, right? That shift, that nothingness. You would end up in a padded room, in a padded cell, medicated
Totally.
somewhere. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And especially if you are already sort of, like I said, you don't have that knowing that I spoke of, right? So you don't know that, okay, this is shit, but I somehow know, I somewhere deep down, that I'm okay, you know. And then you know, I suppose it saved me also because I bet you that without that insight, I would probably have ended up going to psychiatrist or someone, and I would have probably been diagnosed with some sort of depression or something, and maybe even put on
Some
some
sort of
drugs, which I
ism.
don't think I would have.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it happens to a lot of people, you know, which is why I think I'm so grateful that there's more and more conversations about this, as this part being part of the process, and especially the thing called like the emergence phenomena, which spiritual emergence, you know, where all these things and way more extreme, way more disturbing happen to people, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, for me, I needed to sort of understand what was happening to me, and I started seeking out teachers. And I was lucky enough to find Adi Ashanti early on. I know you really love Adi Ashanti as well.
Yeah.
did you find yourself finding someone that you could relate to? And like, did you read anything and go, oh my God, this is what's happening to me? Like did they give you like a map of awakening for you to use? Or were you just floundering around?
I was totally floundering around for years, Gareth. That lasted years, on and off. Okay. So there was a point at which these things subsided naturally, somehow. But then, even when I'm talking the worst bits, like the terror, the whatever, the like, I don't know who I am kind of a thing in a sort of very disturbing way. That has subsided eventually. I don't remember it, after a very long time. And then gradually I was now sort of back in life and just doing things, but that feeling that something within me was crumbling and I still didn't know who I was, that was there all the time, all the time. And then I remember at some point in all those years, I was listening to opera. And only because I listened to opera, I came across Adyashanti because she interviewed him.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would not look for spiritual teachers because I was completely not interested in this still. I was not interested in spirituality at all. So I wasn't looking in therapy for help and I wasn't looking in spirituality for help. I kept on telling myself it was just a thought and somehow think that this will do, basically, And so I watched this guy and I thought, wow, this is like he's a spiritual teacher. Like he sounded so, by comparison to the books that I read in the past, I actually could understand bits of what he was saying. And then I remember watching one interview. I looked him up on the internet and I came across another interview with him. And that was the first time he talked about the fundamental, because someone asked him what is awakening. And he said, well, it's a fundamental shift in perception, but it's like it never go back. It's permanent. Like you never go back from that. So that's when I realized that what happened to me, spiritual people considered an awakening. But that was it. And not only that, I then listened to some other teachers being interviewed on that same channel, and I couldn't bear listening to them because of the terminology. And then especially like all I kept on hearing from them is that awakening is only possible if you meditate for hours and you're like dedicated to like this spiritual practice. And I was like, hold on a second. If I, as this person who'd never meditated, had that insight out of the blue, and I never meditated for 5 seconds, okay, I have no practice, I'm not spiritual, nothing. If this happened to me, this can happen to anyone. So this is bullshit, So I was like, is this spirituality? Like, this is the bullshit that they're selling to people? I'm out. So I was even more anti-spirituality. And I was also like really disillusioned because I also heard them talk about this bliss, like constant bliss. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I'm having these waves of terror. Like, what bliss are you referring to? So I felt like they were just bullshitting people, And sorry, like, I was angry, I was really angry.
Sure.
Because I was angry because I definitely didn't feel blissed out at all. Far from it, quite the opposite. But I also really didn't like the fact that they were innocent. I'm not saying they were doing this. I'm speaking from the place of at the time how I saw it, right? That I felt like they were alienating people this way, that they were basically perpetuating this image of awakening as only available to certain people and only if you fill all these conditions, i.e. sit on a meditative cushion for hours and so on. And that alone I knew was not true. And I was like, oh my God, so now you're making the awakening exclusive. Like this is an exclusive thing when I
or
know
sit with a
enough.
teacher for 20 years, right? Yeah.
Or go to India, leave your family, leave your business, go to India, sit in the ashram, and like whatever in the extreme sense of this, that I heard too, So even more so, this whole thing that way, I was even less interested in spirituality because of this. And because I just knew that what I experienced was universal. I knew even at that stage, that was universal. That was available to everybody. So I was like, I'm out, So I'm out. I didn't even get in to get out, it wasn't in enough to, So for years, I just kind of like, I was mostly okay then, with, like I said, the lingering feeling like I didn't know who I was anymore. And then eventually there was a year where there's lots of good happening, but also lots of like challenges in my personal life. And there was one particular situation where it just finished me, Gareth. Like I had such a massive emotional breakdown that I've never experienced anything like it before. And it happened on my walk, and I just broke down. I felt like my heart broke open, and I just screamed in the middle of the woods, I can't fucking do this anymore, and I didn't even know what was it that I didn't or couldn't do anymore. I just, it was so painful, but it was the most liberating feeling I have experienced in years. It's almost as though my heart was closed for years and all of a sudden it opened up, and there was such emotional release. It was as if my body was holding so much that was suppressed, that was now coming up to the surface. And that's, now I know, looking at retrospect, that I was the first awakening. The whole nature of thought was hijacked by the mind to use it as a shield, to shield myself from uncomfortable sensations in my body, from uncomfortable, painful emotions, But now I had no choice. Like, life basically did something. I could not feel anymore. So I would say this was the first time I would say suffering was finally allowed, fully.
I know exactly what you're talking about, because I went through the first phase of the honeymoon. Everything is like, I no suffering, I'm free, nothing bothers me. I can just step back into my shell, right? I felt like a turtle being able to pull all its limbs and its head back in, and I'm safe in here, and nothing can affect me in the outside. And now I feel more than I've ever felt. Like, I feel like I feel everything. I did an interview with a woman a few days ago. She made me cry on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good for her. Good for her. And good for you that you did. Yeah.
Yeah. No, the camera wasn't on me, so the people didn't see.
Oh, no. They completely missed out. No.
But I did. I had a tear when I was listening to her talk, and it was the first time. But I get it, right? It's the mechanism that keeps you, all that stuff pushed down, keeps you protected, is breaking apart. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Of course, I didn't know that. I knew none of it. I just knew that, all of a sudden I was just, the way I tried to describe it, it really felt like something took over that day. That wasn't me. Like, I found myself on a river, like a boat being swept by this current.
Yeah.
And it was so powerful. For the first time in my life, I felt I was really not in charge of what was going on or what was going to happen.
Funny you use that terminology, because that's how I felt as well. It was like I was holding on for dear life, and the tighter I held on, it felt like there was more coming at me. It was more painful, and it's only when you let go, you're just like, oh, the river has me. Oh, I'm fine. I just go where the river takes me.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, I've heard the word surrender and everything, and it's like, you can't actually do surrender, surrender sort of happens. And I feel like that's what happened. That emotional breakdown was really, I say that, like, life surrendered me, in a sense, to that flow. And so I had no idea what was going to happen. I knew that there was a palpable momentum that kind of picked up that day. And I just knew that it wasn't going to stop, and that I just have to go with it. But even then, there was no choice. There was no like, oh, should I go with it or should I not go with it? I was just on it, I was just basically on it. And I was plunged right into what I call the darkest night, very, very soon. So, those years that I talked about, there were like multiple dark nights, multiple, on and off. I called this one the darkest night because it was like the most probably intense, I would say, of them all. And also very, very different because I say in the book, I don't know if you're familiar with Jed McKenna books.
I've
like
heard of Jed
Enlightenment.
McKenna, yeah.
Yeah. So I was, okay, because I skipped. this is, you know how you say that there was a point at which you started looking for teachers and like exploring spirituality. Okay. Right. Jed McKenna. Yeah. So remember how you said there was a point at which you started like looking for teachers and sort of exploring spirituality and like what else is out there. So that happened after the emotional breakdown for me.
Okay.
I started all of a sudden, I don't even know how that started, to be honest, but I was completely baffled that I was on YouTube looking for things about awakening when I had no interest in awakening whatsoever. You know what I mean? But I was clearly looking for answers. Now I know that I was looking for answers as to what the hell was going on with me. Long story short, how I came across this book by Jed McKenna, and he was literally, this is probably the most non-BS thing about awakening that I've ever read. He really seems like he just wants to strip all the bullshit that's out there about awakening in a very non-apologetic, very kind of, and I remember that book made me feel a bit uncomfortable for some reason, but it was very impactful on a level that I can't even explain. But I do remember thinking, he's really exaggerating, this guy. Like, he was talking about all this like annihilation, total annihilation, and nothing less than that. That people think awakening is just living spiritual lifestyle or doing a mantra or meditating, but like that has nothing to do with awakening, and it's like a carnage basically and everything. And I'm like, mate, like, calm down. So, so I thought he was exaggerating basically, because I was thinking about it on the basis that like if what I experienced was the awakening years earlier, sure, I went through this really difficult time, but the stuff that he's talking about, like the annihilation and stuff, it was just like, really? That's a bit much. And honestly, I think it took weeks from the moment I read this book when I was plunged into this, what I call the darkest night. And are you there?
Yeah, no, I'm here. I'm here. Maggie, do you think this whole kind of annihilation, like spiritual awakening, been almost like a disaster that happens, like a car crash? Do you think that is something to do with us Westerners, right? Not being prepared for it. Like I don't know, obviously India is a big place, but I know a lot of Indian children, as soon as they're going to school, they're practicing pranayama, they're doing yoga asanas, preparing their system for awakening. Do you think that's what we're lacking? Like, we don't do any of that, do we? It's like it happens to us and then we're like kind of flapping around, and then maybe we do that work afterwards, integration work and the shadow work.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the yoga part and like just the awareness of there being something greater, right? Is definitely there way more than it is here, or certainly not in a way. Now it's different. So we're not even sort of educated to look in this direction, the way they do. But I know that, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I also know that I know that within those traditions, there's actually quite a bit of focus on spiritual perfection and purification process. And while I understand that now a bit more and what this is about, I also see it as an incredible trap, and how basically the mind hijacks this whole thing and creates like spiritual identity. So rather than annihilating or seeing through the identity, it sort of wraps itself around those teachings and you become this spiritual person, and then the suppression then happens on those bases, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? So because you think that it's unspiritual to have certain emotions, to experience certain emotions or even thoughts, then you start suppressing what are totally natural human things, So I think that there's like a double thing going on here, where there's way more awareness on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think there's a lot of suppression going on in the name of spiritual progress, so to speak.
Yeah, I also noticed, when I was going through my awakening, bit around my family, right, and getting frustrated with them and angry, and then all of a sudden, oh, there's angry girl. I thought you were spiritual. That's not very spiritual of you to get angry. And it's like, well, like your human still processes all that kind of emotion and anger and all of that kind of stuff. It just feels very, and I think to want to suppress that, it's such a bad idea.
It's the worst. It's the worst. And honestly, like for me, that darkest night was about that because I was basically plunged into it. And I didn't know at the time that this is what was happening was called the shadow work because I was not doing the shadow work. But it now I know that what it was. So in other words, there was so much about me that started coming up to the surface that I didn't see before. It's almost as if the unconscious was becoming conscious. And I
Mm,
started seeing, I had to imagine. To me, this was one of the most important parts of this journey, to be honest. When basically I was pointing finger at certain people and blaming them and accusing them of certain things, and I almost started doing a bit of like victimhood at some point, which was kind of surprising to me. And all of a sudden, like I felt like the finger that I was pointing at those people started pointing at me. And all of a sudden I
yeah.
was seeing the very things that annoyed me and in other people, triggered me in other people, that I judged in other people. Especially I started seeing all those things in myself, and that was absolutely devastating. I can't even, like, the so-called ego, it was completely crashing because all of a sudden, the gap between me and the people I felt better than, or more noble, or more moral, or more whatever, it started closing. And until I was basically on the floor, on my knees, completely humbled by life and no longer seeing myself as any different from the very people that I judged,
Yeah.
in a way
Yeah.
that could only describe as total freaking annihilation, exactly like Jed McKenna was talking about. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like I ate such a humble pie, because he was talking about this very same process as being the key uh, a part of the awakening process that
Yeah.
no one talks about, and so again, it was just like I couldn't believe that I found myself in that process literally weeks after I read that book, and I no longer thought he was exaggerating because I lived through it. It was the most devastating, the most humbling, and the most humiliating experience I've ever been through, for which now I'm so grateful, and I also think that this is to me, this is should be in all those books that write about awakening. This should be like one of the stages, as important as any profound shift. The way I see it anyway now.
Yeah, well, I think in order for the awakening to go into the further stages, all of that stuff needs to come up, right? Because it's in us, it's stored in our
Hmm.
bodies, in the cell, right, and in the cells, and the trauma causes a contraction in us, and as we know, like, especially with the later stages of awakening, like unity, it's awakening to everything as it is, the good and the bad, right? So you're just opening
Yeah.
up to everything. Whereas the trauma is causing
Yeah.
a contraction. So it has to be brought up. It has to be felt. It has to be lived
Yeah.
through. And I don't think there's any escape in it. Maybe, like, but I think most people, it comes up and it slaps them in the face at some stage.
Yeah, I think, from what I've learned, I can totally track now, the little, like almost create like a little map of the pivotal moments and shifts. But I've learned that this process, even though in hindsight it sort of looks linear, it's not linear. And I truly believe that for awakening to be embodied, fully lived in every second, in every circumstance, in every situation, in life, exactly as it is, there is no skipping that. The
Mm,
eventually, it doesn't matter what stage, because some people, the first awakening is actually what usually happens to people later on.
yeah.
They're plunged right into like the deep end. But I've noticed that no matter what stage, no matter what happens first, that bit, in other words, dealing with those suppressed emotions and trauma and all sorts of contractions, is absolutely, to me, this is awakening process. So I don't see it as separate from it. To me, this is awakening process. And I can't imagine, now when I look back, it's like after the first awakening, once the very long honeymoon period, as you called it, came to an end, I felt like I was living for years numb and sort of cut off from my head, and then after the breakdown, I started reconnecting with my body, and I started to actually feel emotions with my body as well, and in my body fully. And then after the darkest night is what followed was I think you call it unity. I'm not very precious about these terms, so like but I call it actually emptiness, because, or empty fullness, and unity, because this is when, to me, at least in my experience, this is when the sense of separation has completely come to an end. There was no like formless and form, divine and human, it was all sort of came together. But it came through facing the void. So this was really interesting, that the void that I tried to, like, I was so afraid of all those years earlier, that I was afraid I was going to be sucked into and die. That void opened up, only that this time there was no resistance to it. So I kind of plunged into it, and I was shocked to what emerged out of it, that what I call the empty fullness, and the end of separation.
Yeah, very, very similar to me. And you just hit the nail on the head there. I had the experience of that nothingness before unity, and it was terrifying because there was still like a contracted I-ness at the center of what I was that felt like it was being annihilated. And later on, after unity, it was like the I dissolved. So it was the nothingness was sort of more natural. It was like, I'm already gone. I can fall into it much easier. There was no fear, that existential crisis or terror. It just didn't seem to be there.
Yeah, so this is, I think, what was gone is like, once I faced the very thing I feared so much, which was that fear, which really was fear of being nobody, and fear of non-existence. That's when that fear of non-existence dissolved, and it was like the darkness became light. There was no separation between the two, and that was, so I would say there were like multiple things happen in that moment. There was the end of separation, almost like touching God, the creative force in motion. It was that wholeness with capital W that includes everything, including the very things we want to suppress and push away, which I call the ugly bits, about ourselves. All of the sudden, it was almost like it was not only excluded in there, but it was very much embraced. And actually it was almost like, I call it like a safety. It was still a landing place. I still call it now a landing place, because it was almost like, I call it like empty fullness, and it felt like this fluffy cushion that I sort of landed on, where now it was like the safety with capital S, where I could now look at anything, no matter how disturbing, and like have compassion for all of it, not just in myself, but also in other people. And I really felt like, and this like knot that I had in my belly, because I had this like real knot in my belly where that fear of non-existence was almost like lodged, so that's when that dissolved as well. But it was incredible, because the compassion that I lost after first awakening, when I couldn't feel my own emotions, let alone being with other people's emotions, like all of that was gone. My heart was wide open. Compassion was back. Like I was just like, so I went into this like loving everything, loving like whatever, obviously that's settled later on, but this was very, very pivotal moment. And I felt the darkest night and the shadow work and everything was just like a prep for facing that deepest fear of non-existence.
So Maggie, that non-existence and the gut, that there's a connection there, right? Because it's like awakening in the head, in the heart, and then in the gut. And the gut is like that, that knot that's that kind of gets dissolved in the Brahman stage.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also, I mean, this is this is the deepest fear. That's where the existential fear,
Mm,
the fear of abandonment, the deepest aloneness, brokenness, all of that is lodged in that, because it comes out of that belief in separation. Once that dissolves, then that goes too. So, again, I found that actually Pierce, I think he talks
Pierce
about
Salguero.
this in Pierce Del Guerrero, which I very much recommend, his book that is yet to come, but about the threads, and I think he
Yeah,
so brilliantly talks about it, because as soon as you put a name to an experience, like for example, I've spoke about experience of emptiness to quite a few people now, and each person experienced it differently.
yeah.
And so it's like, I think that's really important to know, because I think especially if we have some kind of attached to a certain model or how this is supposed to play out, then can, like, again, it's like the mind like we sort of close ourselves to the possibility that it might happen very differently in very unexpected ways. So I just call it emptiness because I call it emptiness. But like when I talk to people who've had those experiences, this also how I actually experience it relates to other names that they would use. So my point is, it's not about not using terminology or names. I have nothing against this stuff. I'm just saying that all those experiences are experienced differently by different people. I don't know if you've noticed that, because you've spoken to so many people by now.
Yeah, well, yeah, something I noticed that is like everybody's awakening is totally different. And I mean, we don't really understand it when we're going through our own awakening, right? We're kind of like using our words to describe it, and I think
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't do it any justice for the other person, right? Who you're communicating with, who might be going through their own awakening, because they're having
Mm-hmm.
their own unique version of it. They've got their own body, mind, nervous system. They feel it different. They use different language, and our metaphors are never the same. So I think yeah,
Yeah.
it's quite difficult. It really is. I that's why I really liked Pierce's his kind of model of not really having a model, just this sort of fluid, these threads, and you can be on any one of them or multiple ones at different
Mm-hmm.
stages,
Mm-hmm.
rather than it being like linear. Now you're in unity consciousness, and then Brahman, and then para Brahman, because it doesn't seem to be like that for a lot of people.
It really doesn't. And you know what? I see it as such a great news. This is what I love about this journey, because to me, just it's life itself continually saying to people, to us, don't hold on to any idea of how this is meant to play out.
Mm.
And like I said, I've seen people experience various shifts in a different sequence, in a different way.
Yeah,
But like
yeah,
I've also seen people, dismissing other people's experiences because it didn't sound like what they experienced. And I find, and especially when it comes from teachers, I found it
yes.
so. I was at the receiving end of this, but by the time I was at the receiving end of this, I was kind of, I couldn't take it personally. Like it didn't bother me. It was just something that I saw that was happening. I felt more for other people when like they share something and you have someone jump in and say, it's either this, oh, that's this, or it's that, or it's not that. When actually, if you were really listening, like really listening, then you would find that just because people describe, like, what I'm trying to say, that sometimes people will use different words to describe a profound shift, but they will use a different name, and we will be talking about the same thing. Sometimes,
Mm.
do you know what I mean? Like, just, I don't know, I can't articulate it, but I think you know what I'm
Well,
talking about. It's
no, I
it's like
totally
sometimes
go ahead.
we can speak to someone and we can think we're talking about the same experience, but then upon investigation, and especially in the farther stages where this is really getting more nuanced,
Yeah,
it turns out that we're using similar words, but we're talking about two very different experiences. Whereas you can be describing things differently, but we're talking about fundamentally the same experience. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, look, fundamentally, right, there is only one truth, right? There
Mm-hmm.
is only one truth, right? It's just consciousness experiencing itself or remembering itself through individual units of consciousness, i.e. us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Our little
Mm-hmm.
body minds. But I experienced something very similar to you. I've been around a teacher who, if your experience wasn't the way their experience was, it was discredited. No,
Mm-hmm.
that's not it. That's not how it happened for me. Therefore, your
Mm-hmm.
awakening isn't, valid. Whereas I'm kind of, I was lucky in the sense I never doubted my awakenings. I never kind of went, oh, maybe I didn't, or I was like, no, I don't know. I'm not listening to that. That's I know what I've gone through and I know what my own direct experience is,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm kind of glad. But yeah, I can see how for other people, especially when they admire a teacher or look up to a teacher, it could be
Mm-hmm.
devastating if your experience
Totally.
is yeah.
Yeah, the only reason why I bring this up is because one, I really think to be holding on to any one way these things play out or any one description or any one label, I see how it can be helpful, but I can see how it can be very much the opposite of that, just generally speaking,
Yeah.
because then the mind has a tendency to hold on to it and like, oh, okay, like I can give you an example. There's this wonderful woman that actually listened to my channel and she ages ago contacted me and I must have talked about it on the channel with someone, and she said something along the lines that after listening to the whatever conversation she watched, she realized she's had this massive awakening, but because it happened sort of quietly and not with a bang, like it wasn't like this,
Yeah.
she sort of missed this, and again, because she had this idea that it has to happen in a certain way, that it has to be this like big deal. And as you know, the awakening can happen to different people in different ways. Like it can be very intense, it can be very subtle, it can be all sorts of things, So I'm talking about it for this reason. And also, I'm talking about it because I've spoken to many people who've had that experience with teachers where they shared an experience and it was dismissed because they couldn't possibly have had those experiences unless they meditated or unless they did that
Yeah.
practice or something like that. So I think those conversations are also important.
So all of this stuff was going on, the dark night of the soul. Was there an energetic component to the awakening? Like, did you start going through a Kundalini awakening, like on top of that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, honestly, now when I look back, the surrender, the emotional breakdown, even though like it was an emotional breakdown, I call it surrender, that was already a very visceral, energetic experience. It's funny because it's not until you ask this, I didn't even say it in the book, I think. I just realized that even that experience was already of a very, oops, sorry. Should I
I
start
just
again?
noticed it was really low. No,
I
no, no, go on.
I did that with the first. I forgot to like. Oh my God. I think me and tech, not great company. So let me start again. So I realized just as you asked this question that actually even the surrender, aka emotional breakdown, that was already a very energetic experience.
Yeah.
But after I went through the darkest night and then the emptiness or whatever you want to call it, the dissolution of separation, that was, I would say, both sort of perceptual but primarily energetic experience. Okay. So, in other words, I literally felt like the separation dissolved at the cellular level. So it wasn't just like there's no separation in terms of like perceptually, it was as if my body even dissolved into this
Yes.
emptiness, and like even every cell knew that there was no not separate from God or the whatever divine, and so on. And I had this knot, as I mentioned. It was a physical knot. Honestly, it was so painful in my belly, like above the belly button, that after that experience it dissolved and I haven't had it since. And then after, I don't know how long after that experience, first I went into, and again, I'm not sure what that was to this day. I've heard some people say what that might have been, but I don't know with any degree of certainty. I was literally sitting on this sofa the first time that happened. I was on my laptop, and all of a sudden I felt like I was sucked into some kind of different energetic dimension. But everything was as like, not that I was still in the room and everything, but I felt like something was almost, it was like the silence with, I call it silence with capital S. I've never experienced anything like this before. It wasn't like, it was like an energetic experience of almost like sonic boom that like got me into like something where there was this silence with capital S. I can only describe it that way. And because I never meditated, I don't know what meditation feels like. But if I were to guess, I would have said that maybe it's like this. I felt like something was meditating me. Like it was like such a profound silence. I call it like a respite, because after all this turmoil that I've been through, it was just such an unbelievable experience. Someone suggested that it's samadhi what I experienced, but
That sounds like samadhi, the absolute meditating you.
So yeah, oh right, really? People did.
Yes,
Wow,
yes.
that's literally what it felt like. Something was meditating me.
Yeah.
And I was amazed because it felt also like a deepest rest. I can call it like the deepest rest, you know. But I remember I was astounded because one day I was walking somewhere, and that boom, it was like I call it like a boom. It was just in an instant, something like started doing that again. It continued even though I walked. I couldn't believe it with my eyes open, meeting people. It was still going on.
So there's three types of samadhi. So there's Savakalpa samadhi, which is where you go into absorption, where your mind is still active, right? You can still hear, you can still think, but you're just totally in that meditative state. You've become meditation. There's Nirvikalpa samadhi, where all experience disappears. It's like you just disappear, you come back, it's like part of your life has disappeared, you know, that time is just gone. And then there's Sahaja samadhi, is where it just becomes like everyday waking state. You wake up, you're just in it constantly, walking, interacting. You're
unbelievable. Yeah. So, you know, again, I've had no frame of reference, but I was just like, I'm so grateful for this, because I was so finished after all these darkest nights and all this emotional turmoil and all this stuff coming up to the surface, that it was almost like by grace something was helping me to rest after all this, you know, and my system to rest.
And Maggie, I have a quick question. Were you in connection with any teachers or gurus or?
No.
So strange.
Sorry, no. Do you mean as this was happening?
Well, in any stage, because usually a lot of these later stages, there's an energetic transmission that comes through a teacher, right?
So at some point, as I was going through the dark night, I was recommended a teacher by someone, and I joined her group. It was like a meeting weekly, you know, but it was like, I mean, she was obviously a teacher, but it was nobody really talked about awakening there. You know what I mean? It was more like everybody shared whatever was going on for them fresh. And a lot of people seemed to be going through some kind of dark night like I did. And then she just spoke to this, like seeing what's happening versus what's true, kind of. That's the best way I can describe it. And so she made it very clear from the start. She was like, she was not getting anyone to awakening or anything. You know, there was no like, it was just very ordinary, but very profound. Just the sharing alone, this was incredible, because it felt like most people there were cracked open and they just couldn't be anything other than honest at this point. So there was no bullshit there or pretense or anything, which is why I liked it, you know, because, you know, it was that alone, just being with those people, hearing them speaking with such heartfelt honesty, to me was incredible. And for me, it was also the first time I realized how much I feared vulnerability, because I realized I'd never allowed myself to be really that vulnerable as well. So interestingly, when I had this experience, I shared it with her a little bit, but she didn't really say much about it. It's almost like and by the way, I don't know why she didn't, but I can tell you that I was grateful both with this shift and the next one that happened, because I feel like I was really I felt something special happened. And I feel like she didn't want to indulge in conversations about these experiences, And I feel like I understand why, because I can see how the mind has the capacity to get stuck on them and feel like, oh, I'm so special, or I
Special,
arrived,
yeah.
when you really haven't, but again, I'm guessing. I just remembered that I shared bits and pieces about this experience with her, but she didn't really say much about this. But yes, to answer your question, that was the weekly gatherings, but there was no talking about awakening stages. There was no talking about any progress. This was literally just sharing and her just speaking from what I say, like clarity,
Okay.
to like what was actually happening in people's lives versus anything lofty or kind of whatever, So she was pointing to it, but in a very she was meeting us where we were at exactly.
Okay.
I don't know. That's the best way I remember it and sort of can describe it. So yeah, so this was my going back to your previous question. That was definitely incredibly energetic. So the samadhi, that was samadhi, that happened. And then all of a sudden, I started having these massive involuntary movements, like I mean, it was, now I'm laughing because it was actually kind of funny, like jumping up the sofa and like we started calling it like spiritual Mexican wave. Um, and throwing my arms. If you sat in front of me and like said some words like consciousness or something, my body would have a reaction to it. Or just when someone spoke with heartfelt honesty, oh my god, if someone spoke their truth without filters and just being honest from the heart, then my body would like, it was almost like a truth meter, my body became
Yeah.
like a truth meter in that sense. So, and that also was interesting because as this was happening, at first it was kind of, I felt like I was developing Tourette's, to be honest, because again, I didn't know anything about Kundalini or anything, but at the same time, it was part of that momentum that picked up,
So you were
like
having
I knew
Kriyas, right?
I was having Kriyas. Now I know it was Kriyas because my partner, funnily enough, who was not into Kundalini or anything, he came across an article about Kundalini and Kriyas, and he said, I think this is what's happening to you, But I didn't feel the urge to find out if that was actually the case or what that actually meant. Again, I mentioned it with a teacher and during the group, and she just said something like, oh yeah, there are these energetic things, and to not pay too much attention, not to make big deal out of this, and that was it. And actually, I even intuitively figured out very quickly that like if I went with it, it was just like better, like to not. Yeah, go ahead.
No. I'm just agreeing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was kind of funny, I would say, for the most part. But then I started having these these surges of energy, but it was so powerful that the first 2-3 times that happened, it was frightening. I honestly felt like I had to like hold on to this sofa literally, because I felt it was either going to lift me off the ground or I was going to explode. It was just unbelievable. And that was frightening at first because I had no idea what the hell what was that, But again, I noticed that the less I resisted it, or contracted as this was happening, then it would dissipate naturally. But then every time it dissipated, I would have this like massive emotional release. Massive.
It was the purification that comes from the energy. Yeah.
Yeah, and at that point, I couldn't even. I've worked through so many things by that point because so much was coming up to the surface that at that point, it felt like layers are being now coming out, and I call it like emptying because it really felt like emptying, that I couldn't even know. I didn't even care what it was anymore. I couldn't consciously access it at this point. It was just so clear that my nervous system was releasing something or my body was releasing something, And then, so I kind of got used to it. And then one night I was in bed. Speaking of continuation of the energetic stuff, I was in bed and I would listen to conscious TV at that point because there were quite a few great conversations there. So I was listening to that like as I was falling asleep. And then because honestly, the host Renate, her voice was so calming. It was
Yeah, she's
unbelievable.
lovely
It was.
voice. Yeah.
She's really lovely. And so I would usually fall asleep and then listen to the rest, pick up where I fell asleep, listen to it on the next day. And so I was kind of in that in and out of sleep kind of state when she was interviewing someone. I don't even remember who, but like I just remember that word consciousness. And I was lying on my back flat, and my like everything, my body started vibrating. The whole room was vibrating, and my head just started moving like side to side, like with speed, and that was frightening again because that was new. I didn't, if someone, honestly, like I said, it's like if someone came in, they would have probably thought that I had like a massive seizure of some kind.
Or possession, right? The mind would immediately,
Possession.
the person is possessed. A demon has come into this person.
Yeah.
And maybe going back through the ages, people have been burnt at the stake for going through a Kundalini awakening,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I cannot imagine if I saw someone, whoever that would have been, having that experience, I would have probably thought either seizure, calling 911, or like maybe even a possession of some sort of, God knows. But yeah, it was just shocking. And all I like, it's like my body, I felt again like everything was preparing my body and everything for this moment, because by then I knew the only thing to do was to try to relax into it, which I did. And as soon as I did, everything, like the energy just blew up. And, I don't know how to, but it was like released, it was released.
Yeah.
And everything disappeared. There was just nothing. No room, no bed. Years ago, if I heard someone talk like that, I would be like, this is nuts, but that's the only way I can describe it. It was just not, there was just nothing. There was just absolutely nothing. All of a sudden, this like bubble appeared, in that nothingness, floating, and something new, but it wasn't me. Something knew that bubble was me and my life. And as soon as this was recognized, because I really can't say that I recognized it, because the I was in that bubble, the I and my life was in that bubble, and I knew that this was consciousness. The bubble was the consciousness, but I was somehow now not I as in I, something was out of it, knowing that this was me and my life in that bubble. And as soon as that recognition happened, I have such chills going through it as I'm talking about it, because as soon as that was recognized, the bubble burst. Yeah. And it was almost like I and my life disappeared. And honestly, I don't remember what happened next, but I think I must have obviously fallen asleep. And then I can't even tell you how long it lasted. I don't know how or when I fell asleep. I don't know. I just know that the next morning, next level of weirdness entering, my regular life of me being the regular person, I sat up on the bed and I was like, there's nobody here. And my partner came in and I said, good morning, and whatever. And I go, there's nobody here, but I'm completely disoriented, but I don't know who's disoriented, so it makes no sense. I literally knew that it made complete sense to something to me, but I was aware that it will sound very weird to him, because obviously my body was there and I was speaking, but there was this complete and palpable sense of goneness. Something was gone, and it was just unbelievable. Like I still can't, it was just so fucking disorienting. And he said that I looked like deer staring at the lights, because he clearly saw that I was disoriented. I had no idea what was going on, because anyway,
Well, so when I'm listening to you talking, it's like the nucleus at the very center disappeared. It's like, so for me, unity kind of happened in two different stages. It was like, first of all, the limitations, the edges of the bubble disappeared, and then the very center of the bubble, a bit like a week or so later, it popped. So it was like the edges came down. But there was still a me at the center that was one with everything. And then that at the center popped. And it was like my I-ness disappeared. And it was just, now everything was just like experience.
Yeah, it sounds very similar. I would say like the unity was like, this is why I call a unity a landing place, or the emptiness technically was a landing place, because there was still a sense of I that was one with something.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and there was like a groundless ground.
Yes.
But there was still a ground. Okay,
Yes.
whereas with the nothingness, that sense of I gone.
Yeah.
Or any center gone.
The center point. Yeah.
There was no center, there was no edges, nothing.
Yes,
anymore.
exactly.
So I think that's the best way. I think I would say
that's exactly how I'm
yeah,
trying to describe it. Yeah, the center just disappeared.
Yeah, like no edges, no I in the center, no edges, something like that. I would say, if we like use this metaphor, I suppose. And so I got up and I just started cleaning, and I moved around, and like it was just unbelievable because I was cleaning and like the hands were moving and legs were moving, but there was no sense of I inside that's like controlling this process. Like it was just a happening,
The doer was,
but it was
no longer
so focused. There was no but it was again, it was perceptual, but it was also very energetic. It was a physical experience of like goneness. Like there was like a hollowness. Something was palpably gone.
Yeah.
The idea that there is this separate someone who's like in control of even what I say and do and whatever, that was gone. But it was like that activity was the only thing that existed in the entire universe, and I remember looking at the cloth and like the spray, the window spray, and like it was like the most incredible creation. I was like, what? I was looking at it, I was like, what kind of energy must have come together to make this possible, that like it looks real and solid. Like I was literally like, the washing, the window spray basically was like a universe looking at me, like it was just like, wow, like every activity was like everything, like something was staring at me, and I like something was staring at itself or something. This is where it gets like so gibberishy, and I don't really know how to talk about it.
Yeah, the people who haven't gone through it are probably just going, huh?
Yeah, and I'm not surprised. I honestly don't like. I actually, someone recently, when I spoke about something similar with Vivi, I think.
Oh, Vivi, yeah.
I think Vivi. We chatted on my channel about these things, and someone literally went in and like said this is like mental illness, in the comments. Yeah. So again, I mean, we can discuss about how appropriate that was, because I have no tolerance for that kind of thing. So I basically reported the guy, because wasn't even for me. Is disrespectful toward my guest in my little space. I'm not having it. Just because I can tolerate it and I don't take it personally doesn't mean I will be tolerating this, But at the same time, I completely understand, because had I listened to this kind of talk not that long ago, I would have thought the same. I completely understand.
What are these people talking about? Yeah.
Who think that this is like either mental illness or it's just this massive disassociation. To which I'll say also, no disassociation, because there has to be an I to be dissociated from something in the first place. And this was the most focused activity. If we were talking about being present with what's happening, the activity, whether it's cleaning or whatever else, this was the most focused I've never experienced or even knew existed. Because it was like all this was the only thing that existed. Well, in that moment.
I get that as well, right? Because people think that there has to be someone there to do it, right? And it's not that there's nobody there anymore, but it's just like, I don't know. It's like the body just does the stuff. I think it always did. I think we just sort of fooled ourselves into thinking that we were, at the center of it. But the body just has an intelligence, it still eats what it wants to eat. It brushes its teeth in the morning, but it kind of feels like it's just doing it anyway, right?
Yeah. And actually, I always try to, I always love to, I'm happy to talk about these things, and I do, but I also try to like bring it more closer to life and to just like normal human functioning, because to me the no doer bit is almost as though like all those moments that I feel we all have when we are in flow, when we feel like the words are just coming out. The runners, for example, when they're running and they feel like the running is literally happening,
Yeah,
like they're
flow
not
state. Yeah.
actually right. So I would say that I think we all have those moments where things just kind of happen, and they're so effortless. It's like the moments when we say we got out of our own way, or I don't know where those words came from when I was speaking to this person, or when writing a book or creating. Artists probably will be most
Yeah.
likely to relate to this, where they feel like the words or the inspiration comes from something other than, and like they're not actually doing it, they're more like a conduit. The body is like a conduit. So I think we all have those experiences. It's just that we don't pay attention enough to get curious as to like what's going on. But yeah, it's, and then even that settles, because for me it sounds very dramatic, and it can feel very dramatic and disorienting at first, but even that settles, and then like after about a week, it was like nothing happened. Like I was no longer seeing my washing window spray or ironing as miraculous
Yeah,
things,
it normalizes.
so even that settles to the point that, again, I shared it with the teacher, and the teacher was like, she just said, "Are you here now?" And I'm like, "Yes." And we moved on, and it was almost like, again, I'm glad that she did that. And, people have different ideas as to why she might have reacted that way or whatever. It doesn't matter. To me, it allowed me to move very quickly from this. So what I mean by that, it's like the disorientation dissipated after about a week, I think. And then I didn't even think about it at all. I didn't even think about what had happened, like it was not an issue, even. It was no problem. It sort of settled very quickly for me, thankfully. And I know that, again, it may be not the case for many people. Some people literally forget how to eat. Okay. Some people forget how to use forks and knives and drive, or yeah. So again, I think it's great to remember that there is a spectrum, and that different people go through these experiences differently. I, for whatever reason, happened to settle into this, so it wasn't even something I would talk about. But of course, now in hindsight, I know that this was the nothingness, no doer, or like whatever, um that's what it's called. Like these are the labels, but like I really just don't talk about it unless someone asks me. I don't even think about it. It's just completely
Yeah.
irrelevant, because at this point there's like not even a distinction, doer, no doer. There's no distinction. It doesn't matter. You want to talk about, so when I hear people like not using pronouns or asking who is doing whatever they're doing, I'm like, mate, who cares?
Yeah, I don't buy into that. I never,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't use
Yeah,
that
but you know what I'm
language.
talking about, right?
Yeah, yeah, of
But
course.
yeah, I mean, sometimes it depends, because if someone asks this question out of genuine curiosity because they're genuinely confused but curious and want to explore this, that's
Sure.
different. That's a completely different. But a lot of times it's just like, I feel that every shift can be hijacked by the mind, no matter how profound, and it's going to stay there, and it's going to be conceptualized, and then, you know what I mean, like maybe not a shift, but no, wrong, not a shift. Every knowledge, every about, rather, like concepts,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm trying, like,
Concepts.
you can tell when someone is speaking from conceptual understanding versus direct experience, because when someone speaks about these things about from direct experience, the use of pronouns or who's doing what, doer, no doer, honestly, none of this at some point, because there's another shift that happens, which I can't even refer to as a shift after that, where I would say the whole distinction collapses. So
The collapse
illusory
of awakening. Yeah.
right, so like the collapse of the whole story of awakening, the shifts, the whatever, all of that collapses, and then honestly there's just such a freaking amazing ordinariness of just being human, um that in many ways to me it's like it's I suppose this is my favorite bit.
Yeah, but it's like I went through the very same thing, and I think it was around the time I did the interview with you. It had just sort of happened, and
Yes.
I was like, I kind of just got up one morning, and it was like it was an awakening from awakening, and it was like the awakening just never even happened, and it was like what am I even and for weeks leading up to it, I felt like an imposter. I'm like, what? I'm speaking, I'm having conversations on Zoom about awakening, and I feel like it's never happened. Who am I? Who gave me permission to talk about this? I just felt like the biggest
Right.
imposter, and the whole thing just imploded on itself.
Yeah, the whole thing. Yeah, and I have to say I loved this. I felt for you because I recognized sort of what was going on, but at the same time I was so almost like I don't have a better word because it sounds so grand, but I was honored that I got to be the one where this was happening in my space, so to speak, because
Yeah,
it was so honest and it was so real and it was
yeah.
such a beautiful expression of what this is actually, how that actually feels initially, you know?
Well, it was really raw, and I think even I spoke with you. I was like, I feel like just closing everything down.
Yep.
I don't want to talk
Yep.
about it anymore. I'm like, I just
Yep.
disappear. I still kind of feel a little bit like that. I still kind of, I'm like, I don't want. I did in Lithuania recently. I did a silent retreat, and it was the best thing I ever did. I was like, I
Really?
don't have to talk about anything for a week.
Of course. Oh, that's why. Oh my God. Yeah, that makes complete sense. Yeah. No,
That's
but
why I love the podcast. I love listening to other people. I'm just tired of talking about it myself. So when you're talking about it, I'm just like, yeah, this is great. I love it. But when you ask me, I'm real, yeah, I'm just tired of talking about it.
I complete, when this, what shall we call it, the collapse of awakening or
Collapsing,
whatever,
yeah,
when that happened, my first reaction was I laughed. I was like, this is like the biggest fucking cosmic joke, you know?
yeah,
But the other thing was that my first reaction was I understood the stories of all of these like teachers from like way back, way back when they had these profound experiences and they say how they went to caves for
yeah,
years or something like that, or just disappeared. I completely understood that in that moment, because had I had different circumstances, lived in a different timeline with slightly different circumstances, I honestly felt like I just wanted to fuck off to some kind of cave as far as possible from here and just not speak for as long as possible, because what revealed itself also was sort of so humbling at the greatest expression of how I see that word, humbling, that I know fuck all. And
yeah,
I
really, yeah,
really, that
yeah.
I know, I apologize for my
No, it's
French,
fine. It's fine.
but it's truly what that felt like. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, literally on the next day, I said, I don't think I'll ever talk about this again, because I felt like I was like, all of a sudden, everything even though my knowledge was so limited, still, like, so little did I know about the process of awakening and the terminology. I still felt like everything I've read and everything I shared with people was like a fabrication, like one massive fabrication.
Yeah,
And I just didn't want to like say more to add to the list, and it went for a while. I genuinely thought I was going to close up my YouTube and just like close the shop and like just go and drink a cup of tea and just go walk on the grass or something, because so when I met you, when we had that conversation, I so felt for you, because it's kind of, yeah, it can be like, well, now what, sort of,
well, stuff still works, right?
but
Because
that's, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I would have a Tuesday and Friday Zoom meditation, right? And there would be maybe 100 people would turn up, and I would open up the
Hmm.
first 15, 20 minutes to questions, and I would sit there talking about it. And then at the time we did that interview, I just went, okay, I'm not doing talking anymore. And everybody's just turning up and they're all just sitting there looking at me in silence. And I'm like, okay, let's meditate. And it was totally taken away. I just stopped it completely. No more. I'm not talking. I'm not answering questions. I was just done. I was just done. I just
I hear
nothing
you.
that's coming out of this mouth is gonna make a difference. I've answered the same questions a million times in different ways to different people. I just don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, I didn't want to add to the list of fabrication, and so I wrote the book, which is even the biggest joke. Because why am I saying this? It's because it literally, like, at that point, if you ever told me that I was going to write a book about this journey, I would laugh so hard and told you that you probably lost it, or like ask you, what did you smoke? Because this is literally the last thing. I didn't have any interest or drive or desire to share my story,
Yeah.
because all of a sudden it looked like nothing actually happened. And again, like I
Yes.
said, I would, by talking about this as if it did, like it's this real thing and it's such a big deal, all of a sudden, all these like stages and progress, like all these stages sounded like just such
It just feels like a
nonsense to me,
dream now, right? Doesn't it? It's something you dreamt up.
like you something you dreamt up, and so I was really shocked when this happened, because one day I just, like, I was listening to a podcast, because I still enjoyed listening to, eventually I started listening to some podcasts that I enjoyed listening to, and someone said something and I just started scribbling things, and the scribbling wouldn't stop, and I was writing like crazy. I was writing like I'm going to die in 2 days, and I basically have to like share this so someone can keep it and read it, and maybe that's going to be useful. It really felt like that. And I remember, like, literally after, I don't know, 2 months or something like that, I stared at like 200 pages of my gibberishing. You said to a friend, like, I think the book wants to be written, but I like really don't want to write the book. So it really felt like it was happening despite of me. And I'm glad, and and it's here and it adds to the list of fabrications. But
Well, also, Maggie, I think from doing so many interviews and reading so many comments, people
Mhm.
do really genuinely appreciate the conversations, because maybe they're on a certain part of their journey where this existential crisis is coming up for them. They're struggling to find a landing place.
Yeah.
And listening to us talking about it, it kind of, okay, I know that this is just temporary, a little bit down the line, things are going to smooth
Mhm.
out. So I do think there is a
Oh,
need to have
absolutely.
these
And this is
conversations.
something, once I went into this, I'm done, never gonna speak about it, even that settled. And I realized, okay, those may be fabrications ultimately, but they're nevertheless useful to some people. And like Adi Ashanti's The End of Your World was such an important book for
Me
me.
too. Me too. Yeah.
It was the first time that someone brought this thing to like life and actually saw the side, because so much about awakening that's being talked about. And again, I'm not being dismissive of it. I don't see this as wrong at all. I don't look at things in those terms anyway. But like, there is primarily focus on like the bliss, the transcendence, the getting to the next stage, the whatever. But so rarely people talk about this really excruciating part of it that happens to many people. I
Hmm.
mean, I have not met anyone yet who's gone through those stages that we spoke of without having to go through this carnage, like emotional, physical, psychological, whatever, and feeling like they are literally losing their minds. And I think that, I keep on talking about wanting to humanize awakening, because I don't know, it kind of breaks my heart, when I just know that so many people feel like excluded from this, even because of the language or because of the terminology that they can't relate to. or they have lives, they have kids, they have responsibilities, and they might be thinking, oh my God, if I don't meditate, or if I, then this is never going to happen to me, or I have to become a spiritual person, and I feel like this book, I think so many people have profound experiences and then they suffer afterwards and they wonder, like I did for years, why this is happening. And so I still don't know why this book wanted to come out. I honestly don't have a clue. By the third draft, I felt like this book was about that. I really just wanted to write something that people feel less alone and feel like, first of all, it happens to regular people like myself, not spiritual, very
Like
down
me?
to earth,
Not
like
spiritual in any way?
yourself.
Yeah.
Didn't have to change the lifestyle at all, in any way, or having to become a different person or anything. If anyway, this has been a process of non-becoming in many ways, or unbecoming, rather than becoming a spiritual person or awakened person or whatever, because that can also become, everything can be hijacked by the mind to become like just a new identity.
Yeah. Spiritual ego.
Spiritual person, awakened person, non-dual, whatever. And that also is part of the process for many people, including myself. But I suppose that I wanted to write for people who, like myself, now it seems to me, that who maybe had those profound experiences, then they were plunged into this like real carnage and thinking they're going crazy, or there's something wrong with them, or that this should not be happening, or they feel like spiritual failures of some kind, especially if they're like in this topic. And I just wanted to kind of normalize it as like, hey, I've been through this and I know a bunch of people who have, this is part of the process. It's not easy. And, one of the things that I say, that to me, this is not so much a book about the journey of awakening. It was a journey of like seeking answers as to why I was suffering still after such a profound first awakening, and I feel like life basically has been showing me those answers ever since. It's still part of it's still on the list of fabrications, but it may or may not be useful, to some.
So Maggie, where can they get hold of your book?
So the book is available in Kindle and in paperback on basically anywhere where there's Amazon.
Okay.
In any country where there's Amazon. So I can
I'll
send you
link
some
below.
Links.
Your website?
Well, I just changed. Okay, so I have the old thing, an old address, not an old web address. So it's www.drmaggieg.com.
You do astrology readings?
I do astrology readings. So yeah, so anyone, but again, I just a heads up in case someone is wondering, because believe me, some people cannot reconcile that how I'm talking about this and non-duality and stuff like that, and I'm doing astrology, because some people still see it as like two separate things for some reason. But I'm not like a forecaster, like
you're not doing tarot cards.
I'm meaning that like I don't like talk about future or anything like that. This will happen. You will get married. You won't get married. I honestly use astrology because I found it to be an incredible, after I've been through the shadow work, I've seen it as an incredible tool to look at the unconscious patterns and where they kind of originate from, because one of the things, we didn't talk about it much, because like we already spent a lot of time, but like the last chapter in the book is all about the somatic part as well of this process.
Well, maybe we'll come back and do a part 2.
Yeah, but I just want to say that my point is that I use astrology specifically for this kind of work. So, the people that usually come to me are people who are already on this journey, and they are in the midst of the shadow work, and they're basically open to hearing some of the things that may be difficult to hear about themselves, but it's always in a space of a lot of compassion and humor, and we can no judgment whatsoever, believe me, so yeah, if anyone is interested, I do both, like one-on-one sessions that just supporting people on this journey basically, and also astrology, and usually we combine the two. together. So,
And you're the host of the podcast as well, right? Humanizing
and
Awakening.
yeah, Humanizing Awakening on YouTube. So I can send you the
I'll
links
put
to
the links.
everything.
I know I have all the links. I'll put them down below. So
Yeah.
anybody who's watching, if you go down into the description, all Maggie's links will be there. Same if you're listening on Spotify, just go down, or Apple, just go down into the description and the links will be there. Maggie, I want to also congratulate you on being my longest podcast. You've beat David Buckland by 45 minutes. So congratulations.
Oh my God. But I have to say, it doesn't surprise me. Unfortunately, I am one of those people that, like, I will say in a nutshell, and then I stop talking after about 20 minutes. You know what I mean? So it's like, I don't even know the concept of in a nutshell. Yeah. But, it's such a massive topic that I applaud you for even trying to make
We did well.
Yeah. But thank you so much. By the way, thank you so much for having me. And also
No
thank you for all
problem.
your support. And thank you so much for your endorsement for the book.
I totally enjoyed it. Really, really, really. You've been fabulous. And maybe we'll get you back on again and we'll do another 2.5 hour session. I will.
Thank
Maggie,
you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the viewers and listeners. If you've gotten to this part, you've done well. Yeah, 2.5 hours of conversation.
Congratulations.
On nothing, on absolute nothing.
Right.
Okay,
Yep.
Take care. Bye-bye.
This has been the Endless Possibilities Podcast, where the journey of spiritual awakening and energy healing unfolds. Garrett is a lifelong seeker of truth, a spiritual teacher and author, and it's his passion to delve into the profound world of consciousness. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we hope you've gotten something from it. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, the podcast is available on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms. Find us on Instagram at _mother_force. Take care, and we'll see you soon on the Endless Possibilities Podcast.